up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Today I got a really exciting mod. This is a mod that I've been waiting to do for a very long time. I'm gonna be putting in my new suspension. So I have here some Bilstein shocks along with some RCE Yellow lowering springs. So these springs will actually work with the stock suspension, like the stock struts, but anytime you put lowering springs on stock parts, you're probably gonna, wear them out prematurely. So I decided that I wanted to get shocks and springs that match together. That way I don't have to worry about anything. And the reason I'm not doing coilovers is because I don't want to mess with, or I don't want to deal with having to adjust them. And then I live in New York. We get a lot of salt in the winter, so I don't want the adjustment to like seize up and then they get stuck. So these are kind of like a set it and forget it type of option. These lowering springs are going to drop your car by about 0.8 inches. I think it's like 22 millimeters, something like that. So it's nothing crazy. The car should still be drivable. Like, you don't have to worry about like scraping on anything or bottoming out. And these are supposed to ride pretty close to stock from what I've heard. I'll find out, after I install them and actually get them out on the road. So one thing that's going to be super important when you guys are doing this is you're going to need a pair of decent spring compressors. So I have a set here that I bought on Amazon. I think they were like 30 bucks. I'll look up where they were and I'll put it in the description somewhere. But you're definitely gonna want some spring compressors, because when it comes to this set, or even if you're gonna use your stock struts, you're gonna need to reuse the same top perch and top hat. So in order to get those off of the current suspension, the stock suspension, you're gonna need spring compressors to release the tension on that top hat and perch, because otherwise when you go to remove it, they might shoot out. So make sure you guys get a quality set of spring compressors. I think you can also rent them out at your local hardware store. They should have some, or an auto parts store. And then also when you're putting the top hats onto the new suspension, the new springs and struts, you're gonna wanna compress them. That way you can actually fit them on there properly and tighten them down. Another thing that's going to be very helpful and very important is to get some anti-seize. Suspension parts and bolts over time, they can get pretty rusty, they can get pretty stubborn to remove and put back on. So this anti-seize is going to help a lot, because you're going to want to put just a little bit on the threads, on all the bolts when you put everything back together. And that way in the future, if you need to remove them, you don't have to worry about them rusting over or seizing up. So Race Comp Engineering, aka RCE, they also provide a little installation guide, which is, pretty good. The installation guide that they provide is mostly for when you're putting these lowering springs on the stock suspension. So it should be pretty similar if you're gonna put it on the Bilstein struts instead of the stock struts, but there's gonna be a few little differences. Each of the struts also come with like a little installation guide that is pretty helpful. There's some inconsistencies that I found, so I'll point those out later on. But yeah, I'm basically going to be using this installation guide in conjunction with the little installation guides that are in each individual box. So here's a list of all the tools you're going to need per Race Comp Engineering. So if you want to take a look at this, just pause the video now. Now I have the car inside the garage. I already took measurements at each corner, so I'll put the heights of each corner up on the screen. As I mentioned before, these lowering springs will drop the right height by about 0.8 inches or 22 millimeters. First thing you want to do is jack up the car on all four sides and then take off all four wheels. Okay, so on the front suspension you have two bolts. You have a bolt on the top and a bolt on the bottom. The one on the top, that is your camber bolt. That's the bolt that you actually want to try to align as best as possible when you put everything back together. So I'm going to show you guys in a little bit, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to actually use a paint marker and mark the current position of the bolt in reference to the knuckle and the strut. And then what I'm going to do is when I put the new suspension on, I'm going to make sure that I put the bolt as close as possible to that same position. Because the thing is, whenever you do any type of suspension work, especially when you change out the struts or springs, you're gonna need an alignment. But you can't just go get an alignment right away. You need to let the spring settle. So I'm gonna make sure that the camber bolt's as close to the original position as possible. That way the car is still drivable. And then when you're removing the camber bolt, make sure you remove the nut. Don't unscrew the actual bolt itself because, you know, it's lobed, so it could be damaged as you're trying to undo it. So make sure you remove the nut. So leave the camber bolt in whatever position it's currently in and remove the nut. And then you could pull out the whole bolt. Another thing that's going to be very, very helpful is get some PB Blaster and spray down any of the bolts that you're going to be removing. So as I'm working on this front driver side, I'm also going to start spraying down all the bolts on the other corners. That way the PB Blaster can start, you know, working its way into the bolt, and then it'll make it much easier to remove. Because as you can tell here, these bolts are not in the best shape. They're not bad, but you know, some of them look like they're going to be pretty tough to get off. On the rear, you'll see that the bolts actually look like they're in much better shape, which is kind of interesting. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to spray down the bolt that's holding in the strut. You also want to spray down the bolt that's holding in the sway bar to the lower control arm. On the front suspension, you want to remove the brake line. It's a 12mm bolt holding it in. So remove the brake line first because that's connected directly to the strut. And then on the front side, you're going to have a little sensor. I believe this is the ABS sensor. So it's just a little clip. So just press the sides of the clip and then you can disconnect it. So here I have the shock separated from the knuckle. I did have to use a breaker bar when removing the nuts, so just remember that a breaker bar is going to be very helpful. Also, you might want to get a hammer to hammer out the bolts after you take the nuts out because they could get pretty stubborn. And then here I have the two bolts. You know, before you put them on, make sure you use a wire brush to clean off the threads. And then here I have the camber bolt, and as you can see, it has that lobe shape on it. So that's what they use to, you know, align your camber. Another thing to note when you're removing the two bolts at the bottom of the strut, the camber bolt had a nut with it, had a washer. The bottom bolt did not. So just keep that in mind. If yours car is a little bit different, then just make sure that whichever one has a washer, you put a washer on the same bolt. So once you have everything disconnected and unbolted from the bottom, you want to go into your engine bay and you're going to want to find the top hat. So you have one on each side. There's going to be 3 bolts holding in the top hat. And then as you can see here, I actually have a strut bar. So if you have a strut bar, ideally you want to remove the strut bar. That way these bolts are easier to get to. And then what you want to do is you want to remove 2 out of the 3 top hat nuts. You can loosen all 3 of them, but only remove 2, because if you remove all 3, that strut's just gonna fall and possibly damage something. So what you want to do is undo 2 of them, leave 1 there so that way the strut doesn't fall out, and then ideally you want a second person holding the strut as you undo the last bolt. But if you don't have another person, you could do it, you know, you have one arm holding the strut and then you slowly undo the last nut, and as it's slowly dropping, you know, at least you can support it with your one hand. If you have a strut bar, or if the top hat nuts are difficult to get to, one thing that might be very helpful is a swivel socket. So I'll show you guys here. I have a swivel socket, and this helps so that you can remove those nuts while your wrench is at an angle. So it gives you better clearance and better access. So I forgot to show you guys on the driver's side, but here I'm gonna walk over to the passenger side front strut, and you'll see that I have white marks. So I used a paint marker and I painted the actual bolt and painted a line across the strut and onto the actual knuckle. So when I put everything back together, all I have to do is realign that bolt, the camber bolt, with the lines on the knuckle. Okay, so here I have the old strut and spring assembly. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my spring compressors, put it on the stock springs, compress the spring down to relieve the pressure and tension on the top perch. And here's basically what it's going to look like. So as you can see here, I have the spring compressors on. These springs, there's not many coils to them, so I couldn't really fit both spring compressors on there. Ideally, you want to have a spring compressor on one side and one on the opposite side, so that way you compress the springs evenly. At least with the ones that I bought, it's a little bit difficult to do that, so I'm just compressing them from one side. And that still is giving me enough room. So there's a little boot on top you want to remove, and you don't have access to this nut. This is the nut that's holding the whole assembly in.
The nut that attaches the top hat to the strut. On the OEM strut, it's a 17 millimeter. On the Bilstein strut, it's a 19 millimeter. The thread on the inside, that is a 6 millimeter Allen key on both.
When you're taking apart the strut assembly, you need to make sure that the top perch is in the same orientation on the new springs. So not the top hat, this part that swings, but the top perch. That's the one that makes contact with the top of the spring. Usually when people have issues with their suspension, it's because their top perch wasn't aligned properly and you get like weird clunking noises. So this is how you can tell if it's aligned properly. There's a little dot on the top perch. So make sure that dot aligns with the fork at the bottom of the strut. As you can see, it lines up pretty well. So make sure that when you put it on the new strut assembly, that it's aligned in the same spot. Also, if you look at the strut from the side, you'll see that there's a curve on the bottom of the strut, and at the top you'll see that the perch actually pretty much lines up at the same angle. So it's another way that you can tell if your top perch is aligned properly or not. So now, as you can see, I have the strut assembly put back together, and on the new springs I was able to put spring compressors on each side, and then as you can see here, I have the fork lined up properly with the top perch. The dot lines up with the fork. Also, another thing to know when you're putting the top perch back on is there's actually like a little indentation in the perch of where the stock spring sat. So one thing you can do also is after you put everything back together, just try to rotate the perch so that it aligns perfectly with the spring, and if you do that, you should be good. And again, also just make sure that little dot is lined up with the fork. Here I have the little guide that's showing how the front shock assembly gets put together. So as you can see here, first you have the shock, then you have your spring, you have your top perch. There's a little like washer that goes on top of the top perch, and then you have your top hat, and then you have another small washer and the locking nut. And one thing you'll notice with these springs and struts, even with the stock ones, the threads themselves of that shaft will actually rotate with that nut. So what I used is actually a pass-through socket with an Allen key. So the Allen key held the threads in place, and then I used a pass-through socket to tighten or loosen the nut. Don't use an impact. I did that by accident for my first two struts, but it was only to remove it. You don't want to use an impact because you could potentially damage the bearing that's in the top hat. So now that you have the bolts out, this would be a good time to get a wire brush and clean the threads off. My car is a little bit older, so these bolts, they're a little stubborn to remove. So by cleaning the threads, that'll make it easier to put everything back together. And also, I'm gonna put just a small dab of anti-seize. And here you can see just a tiny dab on both. And then as you put the nut on, the nut will actually spread the anti-seize to the rest of the bolt threads. So here I have everything bolted up and tightened up. And as you can see, the camber bolt is now lined up with the marks that I had on my knuckle. So my alignment should be good. So to take out the rear strut assembly, there's a few bolts at the bottom you gotta remove, but also to get access to the top bolts, you have to go into your trunk, and then you'll find this flap. Underneath the flap, you'll see the two bolts holding it in, and on the opposite side, you have the same type of flap. So, you're gonna have to remove your trunk floor and trunk mat. The foam pieces that are there, you can leave. We don't have to remove any of those. And then I actually have here a pop clip removal kit, because you're gonna have to remove some of the pop clips to make it easier to access those bolts. So here, just put down the rear seat, and I actually just removed a few pop clips for the front part of that trunk liner, and that gives me just enough access to get to those bolts. Okay, so now we're at the bottom of the car, and according to the instructions, all you need to do is remove the bolt that's holding in the strut, and then the bolt that's holding in the end link for the sway bar. And then you can put a foot on the wheel or like the hub, push down, and that should give you enough clearance so that you can pull the strut out, I actually had an issue where I didn't have enough clearance, so I couldn't do that. So I had to remove a few more bolts.
This is a 17 millimeter. That is a 14 millimeter.
Okay, so the top two nuts holding in the top of the strut, those are 14 millimeters. Once you have those undone and you have the bolt at the bottom taken out, the strut itself should be loose. So as you can see here, this strut is now loose. There's nothing holding it in anymore, but you can see that the whole wheel, like hub assembly, is still in place. It's not like the front where once you undo the bolts on the strut, the whole knuckle and assembly kind of just like falls over. Here everything stays in place, and what you're supposed to do, put a foot or put some pressure on the hub itself, push down, and then you should have enough clearance to pull out the strut. So just so you guys understand what my issue is, I can't lower, so the lower control arm, I can't push that low enough to have the strut clear. So what I've seen online that other people did is they also removed the bolt that's holding in the lower control arm on the inside, so the innermost point, remove that bolt. And then if you have a limited model or an STI model, you also have a headlight leveling sensor, so remove the bolt for that. So once you remove all those, the lower control arm should just fall down, and then you have more than enough space to take out that strut. Okay, so here I'm on the passenger side, and here I've already removed all the necessary bolts. So the one that's holding in the strut, the sway bar end link, and the one that's holding the lower control arm on the innermost point. And on the passenger side, there is no headlight leveling sensor, so there's no extra nut on this side. And as you can see now, the arm just, folds down, and then you can just pop the strut out without having any clearance issues. Alright guys, so I'm just outside now as I'm working on the final strut. So in order to actually separate the strut and spring, I had to use what's called a pass-through socket. So here I have the socket, and as you'll see, there's literally like a hole in the middle. So that way I can put the socket on the nut that's holding in the whole strut assembly, and then in the middle through the hole I can fit an Allen key to keep the threads from spinning. So I'll show you in a bit. The socket fits right in the middle. The Allen fits right in the middle where those threads are, and then you use your pass-through socket to remove the nut, because otherwise the whole thing spins together. So those threads along with the nut, they're gonna rotate together.
Nut in here that connects the top perch to the strut. On the OEM, it's a 14 millimeter nut. On the Bilstein, it's a 17 millimeter. The Allen thread is a 5 millimeter on both.
Okay, so here I have the little instruction guide. As you can see here, I have the OE dust boot and the OE bump stop. But if I look at the actual Bilstein shock, that blue piece, that's the dust boot, and on top you can see there's a built-in bump stop. So if you're gonna use the stock strut assembly and just updating and you're just upgrading the springs, then yes, reuse the dust boot, reuse the bump stop. If you're gonna be using the Bilstein shock, then do not reuse the dust boot or bump stop. And I believe here in the back of the manual, it even says to basically put everything back together in the reverse order from how you took it apart, except for the bump stop or dust boot. So even though the diagram shows it, in the back there's like a little blurb that even specifies, not to use those parts unless you're reusing the stock strut assembly. And here I have the top perch for the rear shocks, and as you can see, there's like an outline inside the rubber of where the spring ends. And if you can see at the actual spring, see the part here where it ends. So you want to make sure that you line up the top perch to the spring, where it ends. They should match up pretty well. And then I don't think it really matters which spot is forwards or backwards, but there's a little rubber piece here that was facing towards the front of the car when I took it off. So I'm just gonna make sure that when I mount the strut back in the car, that I have the little rubber piece facing the front of the car as well. Alright, so now I'm just gonna show you guys really quickly how everything goes back together. So you have your strut here, and then you have the spring, And make sure when you're putting the spring on, the coils that are closer together go towards the top, and make sure you have the logo facing upwards. If the logo's upside down, you put in the spring wrong. So yeah, you have the shock, spring, there is a little washer that goes on top. Here it is. Then you put your top perch. Make sure you align the end of the spring with those grooves inside the rubber. And you have a washer and then a locking nut. And then when you're tightening everything down, make sure to use your pass-through socket and the Allen key to hold the threads or the shaft in place. Okay, so here I have the whole strut assembly put together. I actually didn't use spring compressors when I was putting this on. I kind of just aligned the inner shaft and had it go through the top perch. While I was holding it there, my brother actually went with the pass-through socket and Allen key and started to tighten down the bolt. And then we kept tightening it until the nut bottomed out. Once it bottomed out and you can't go any further, you literally cannot tighten it anymore. And then one thing you'll notice is that when you're first tightening it, the top hat's gonna look a little crooked, but as you're getting it tighter and tighter, you'll see that it starts to flatten out and it'll look nice and even, how it does here. And the one thing that's good about the Bilstein shock compared to the OEM one is that you can still rotate the whole assembly once everything's put together. So let's say your bottom mount is not aligned properly with the lower control arm. You can literally just grab the top perch and the whole spring assembly and rotate it until you have it in the proper orientation. And the way I remount this is I have the two threads for the top hat. I put those in first. Once the threads stick outside of the trunk, I'll have my brother put the nut on them to secure it, and then I'll lift the lower control arm and put the bolt down there. So here I have the strut fully installed. So now I'm complete with the installation. At the bottom you'll see that I have the lower control arm back in its place. I put the bolts for the inner joint on the lower control arm, the bolt for the sway bar, and the bolt for the bottom of the strut. You might have to push up or down on the hub to get those bolts to go in all the way. So now the only thing left to do is actually get some anti-seize on those threads and tighten them down. And then what I'm going to do also is go through every single nut and bolt that I touched, make sure everything's torqued down properly to the right specifications. And then also I'm going to use the paint marker to paint any bolts or nuts, and that way I can tell if anything starts backing out in the future. Alright guys, so here I have the pass-through socket with the Allen key. So this is what it looked like when I was tightening everything down. So there are torque specs for the top hat, not the top hat nut, the nut that secures the strut assembly. But it's kind of hard to actually torque them down because once the nut is all the way bottomed out, when you tighten it anymore, the whole shaft, like in the threads, rotates with the nut and the whole perch will rotate with it. So you get a torque wrench in there to tighten it. So what I did is I just tightened it as much as I could until I could not tighten it anymore, and I think it should be fine. Like I said before, I'm gonna mark everything down with a white paint marker just to make sure that nothing backs out.